Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Midland Cultural Center, and welcome to A Day in the Life. Now, here is the host of A Day in the Life, Fred Hacker.
Well, hello, and welcome to A Day in the Life. We're delighted to welcome those of you who are in our studio live in the Midland Cultural Center, and we're also pleased to welcome those who are joining us on television. So we hope that you will enjoy this program, and I want to get right to our guest. I'd like to introduce you to a woman who has done so much for this community in so many ways, and we're going to explore that this evening. Would you join with me in welcoming Joyce Hamelin?
Just need to get untangled.
Take your time. We've got lots of that.
Good.
Joyce, thanks so much for agreeing to do this. I've been looking forward to this evening for a long time for a couple of reasons. One is, as I was telling the audience, it's our first time to do this live since January of 2020, and it's almost 2022 now. And secondly, I'm really looking forward to exploring your life and learning more about the inspirations in your life, because you certainly have been an inspiration to this community. So, are you ready?
I'm as ready as I can ever be.
Okay. Well, Joyce, I want to begin. We try and do this program a little bit chronologically, and I want to begin by asking you about early days. And you were born in a place that will surprise some of the people in our audience.
Yes. I was born in Evanston, Illinois.
And your parents were Canadians. Why were you born in Evanston, Illinois?
Those were Depression days. And we had aunts. I had aunts that lived there. And they contacted my dad and said, there's work here. So my mom and dad went to Evanston, Illinois.
And how long did you stay there?
Well, I was a year and a half, and my brother was 6 months old when they decided that that was not where they wanted to bring up their family, and they came back to Canada.
Now, there's a bit of a story about your arrival in Canada. Did you really come into this country legally, Joyce?
Unfortunately, I didn't. But I was 47 years old before I found out. Those were the days when they were saying, anybody who isn't registered, please go and register, because this is a time of reprieve, no punishment involved. My phone rang, and it was my mother. She said, I have something to tell you. You may not be a Canadian. And I said, what? Well, we never did register you. So I went to the appropriate department, and I said, I believe I'm a Canadian, but I'm not sure. And I told her what happened, and she said, so you think you're a Canadian? Well, prove it. And I couldn't.
Yeah.
I had no papers. So I became a card-carrying Canadian.
Good. We're glad you did. Joyce, tell us about your parents. I'm always interested in what the influence on young people is of the upbringing that they receive. Tell us about your folks.
My parents were very loving people. There was always a cup of tea on the table for no matter who came by, no matter what time of day, with my mom. She was a stay-at-home mom. My dad worked very hard. He worked at the mental health center, and he worked at odd jobs on top of that to supplement the family income. And he was a proud father. He was a good dad, and he just adored my mom.
Wonderful.
I just remember him sitting at my dining room table one Christmas, I guess it was, and he looked around the table at all my daughters and said, "Oh, I'm surrounded by beautiful women, but the most beautiful of all is my wife."
That's lovely.
So-
That's great. Now, your mom had a health scare when she came back to Canada.
She did. She spent almost a year in Gravenhurst at a center for people with tuberculosis. So I was a year without a mom.
And how old were you at that time?
I was it was shortly after we came back to Canada, because I remember I was 3 years old when she came back, and I remember hiding and looking at this lady and thinking, so that's my mom. That's what she looks like.
Yeah. Well, at that age, kids would not remember it for a year.
No.
Yeah. Now, I want to explore a topic which, again, some of our audience may not be aware of, and that is that you made a discovery, another discovery about your lineage later in life. Can you tell us about that?
I did. I discovered that I had an indigenous background, that my grandmother, of course, was had left the reservation, or if she ever lived there, because women who left the reservation did not have status. So my grandmother, although we never knew, had status, and so did my mother. And that never became evident until much later on, when my brother, who was an avid hunter, went hunting, and he said he could hunt because he had status. And my sister and I were so concerned. We thought he was lying. We said, "Oh my God, I hope he doesn't get caught." Only to find out later that he had status, and so did we. And I remember the day the letter came in, and I opened it, and it said, "You are an Indian." And I sat there and said, "Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness." So that was very interesting.
Yeah, that would be quite a revelation.
It was.
Now, you have a couple of siblings, had a couple of siblings?
I do. My brother was a year younger. Unfortunately, we lost him. He died just a couple of months ago. And I have a wonderful sister who is just a beautiful person.
Joyce, you told me she was your best friend, and that really touched me.
She is my best friend.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Tell us about your early education.
Well, I started school at age 6 in the Penetanguishene Public School, which of course was the Catholic school. There's a whole history of schools in Penetanguishene, and it doesn't resemble anywhere else, or it didn't. And started learning French. Mm-hmm. My early education was totally in French.
Fascinating, yeah.
And then I went to the Penetanguishene High School. I spent 1 year at Loretto Abbey as a boarder. And then I left school and I went to business college, Shaw's Business College in Midland, as did many young women.
Yes. What was your first job, Joyce?
At an insurance company in Toronto.
Okay. Now, I understand while you were in Toronto, you may have met somebody?
Well, actually, I met my husband at a dance in Midland. I forget what it was called. Might have been called the Blue Room. I forget. They were Friday night dances. Yeah. And I met him. And when I got back to Toronto, he phoned me and we started dating.
So he was living in Toronto at that time as well?
That's right. He was working for CPR.
Okay. And when did you marry?
We married in 1950. Mm-hmm. And then we started having our children.
Yeah, now you've had a few of those, Joyce.
Just a few. 7 daughters and 3 sons.
Wow.
All of them wonderful. not saints, just wonderful. No halos around our family, including their mother, of course.
In the early days, you were a stay-at-home mom?
I was.
And you were telling me that you learned from your mother how to make do.
Well, I did. Everything was homemade. You know, the flour bag came in, 100-pound bag, and we made I made my own bread. I made everything. I found out later from someone in the community that one of my daughters used to auction off her lunch at school. It was all homemade, and Carol's was all store-bought. So there was an exchange there.
Isn't that cute? You got into volunteer work at a fairly early stage. What prompted that?
Well, I had no money, and I had to get out of the house. So, you know, you can only have so much conversation with little kids. And so I became very involved with the Parent Teachers Association. In fact, I was nominated as the secretary, and I got up to say no, and everybody applauded, and that was the end. Never got to say no. So I became active with the Parent Teachers Association, and that led eventually to my running for the school board. So that was a bit of history for Penetanguishene. I was actually the first woman ever elected to a public office.
Congratulations.
And that was a lowly school board.
Yeah. And you actually were a trailblazer because there was a woman elected to council in Penetanguishene.
The following year.
Following year, yeah.
Yes.
Do you remember who that was?
Yes, Frances Sandoval.
Frances Sandoval, yeah.
Frances was so involved with the whole community.
Now, we've those of us who are in the hall here were able to see a video about the CLH program. But I wonder if you would tell us about your first association with what became CLH Developmental Services.
Well, the town of Penetanguishene asked me to sit on their board, appointed me, and they graciously accepted me because we had begun with some classes. Now, times were different because the children went to school. They went to a regular school, but they had to be there half an hour after everybody else arrived, and they had to leave half an hour before anybody else left. So there wasn't much time for school, but it did give them an experience. And I've lost my way now. What was the...
Well, just how you first personally became involved.
I became involved because I sat on the advisory committee,
Right.
and I was familiar with the school system. Then in 1968, when the school boards became regional boards, then the association felt that there would be room for adult programs because now we could concentrate elsewhere. School-age children were being looked after in the regular system, but there had to be an IQ of at least, I think it was 60. Otherwise, we still had people who couldn't attend school.
Right.
So they sent me out to explore other places, which I did, and came back with some suggestions for programs. And actually, it was Dean Nichols who came to see me and said, well, we need to get started. And we advertised for a teacher. Nobody applied. And so he asked me if I would just start the program.
Yeah.
And that's how I got started.
That's how history...
Just start it until we find somebody.
Right. Now, your salary was paid by a service club, if I understand correctly.
Oh, the first few months, the first 6 months, the rent. Each service club in the area, Kiwanis, Lions, you name it, paid a month's rent. I became a very good beggar. And so each of the service clubs paid a month's rent because we had to be in business for 6 months to prove to the government that we had a program.
Right.
And if we could show them that we had a program, we would begin to get grants. And I was so excited. So at the end of 6 months, we proved there was a program, and the grants started to come in. $15 per person. It didn't pay 1 month's rent. So we had to find other ways.
Yeah. Now, where was the association located at that time?
At that time, the program was in the old Brown Spread building, which is the cafe, the European cafe. Mm-hmm. And that's where we were. We were a pop depot. We did all kinds of things. We learned to make in those days when your clothes, men's jackets went to the dry cleaners, they come out with a little puff in them.
Oh, yeah.
And we made those. And the next contract we got was doing the laundry. We installed washer and dryer, commercial. We did laundry for Pillsbury. We packaged every uniform and picked them up every day, laundered them, folded them. They learned folding skills, learned to read sizes, etc. So that was a good contract for us. And then somebody came to me and said, you know, there's good business in making traffic signs. So the City of London is selling their vacuum applicator. So he said, if you think you'd like to do this, and he thought some of our people were competent enough, I will, if you have a Saturday, invite the local communities and I'll tell them about your capabilities. So we began making street signs. We did signs for Mississauga, we did signs for many local municipalities. And we just grew.
Where was the next location?
The next location was down on William Street in a smaller building there. And the Rotary Club helped us a great deal with that. They had raised funds for a school. So $25,000 went toward that building, and the town donated the property.
Right.
So it was a pretty rough building. First day, there were no doors on the washrooms. We hung a curtain. And that came a little bit later. And we just grew from there.
Yeah, great. Now, I'm interested in your reflections. You were there from, I think you told me, 1968 until retiring almost 30 years later.
That's right.
How big had the organization become by then?
Well, by the time I left, we had what we called cradle-to-grave services, and we had a budget of $5.5 million. Wow. It was a far cry from starting out as beggars. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
and how many staff would you have?
It was over 100.
Wow.
And we had, I think, most of the programs that they have now, although they may be delivered in a slightly different way today.
Right.
That too changes.
Joyce, without getting too personal about the individuals, do you have memories of some of the individuals that you served?
Oh, lots of wonderful memories.
Yeah.
I remember, do you think I could mention a name or two? Would that be all right?
If you're comfortable, I'm comfortable.
Well, there was a wonderful young man by the name of Wayne. And Wayne was a firm believer in Santa Claus. And I thought, as an adult, that was not suitable. So I tried to convince him that perhaps there really wasn't a Santa Claus. So he said, oh, but there is. I see him all the time. Well, I couldn't argue with that. After Christmas, I said, well, the next time you see him, tell him I'd like a fur coat for Christmas. He said, I'll do that. So after Christmas, we came back, and I said to Wayne, "So Wayne, what happened to my fur coat?" "Did you ask Santa?" He said, "Of course I did." And I said, "Well, I sure didn't get it." "Ah," he said, "you must have been a bad girl." I never did win the argument.
Well, I have memories of that Wayne.
Yes.
He used to call himself, or we used to call him Mr. Dillon. He was a big fan of Gunsmoke.
Yes.
So we always referred to him as Matt Dillon.
Yes.
Yeah. Looking back over the 30 years you spent with CLH, what emotions are you left with, Joyce?
Well, I think I got to meet a lot of wonderful people. And I saw so many of them grow. And so many of them did get jobs. Not everyone, but so many people did get jobs. And that was so satisfying to see that the community was accepting. It was very difficult at first to have people accept that we were in the community and that we had a lot of capable people working with us, because I think people had been hidden away rather than exposed to the community. And so it was difficult for them to appreciate that there were a lot of good skills just waiting to be developed. And that was very, very satisfying. I remember one young man had worked for one of the local factories, and he worked there for 27 years.
Wow.
When he retired, they had a banquet for him, and I met a gentleman on the street one day, and he said, "I've always wanted to meet you." He said naming the young man at Mr. Cameron's retirement party, he thanked you very much for finding him this job. And I said, "Well," he said, "we thought it was most appropriate. Don't worry about it." Oh.
Joyce, do you keep in touch with any of the folks that you worked with or worked for?
I do meet people occasionally, but no, I haven't got an ongoing relationship with a lot of people, because a lot of the people that were also there when I was there are not there anymore.
Right. I was just doing the arithmetic. It was 24 years, almost a quarter of a century ago that you retired from CLH.
Yeah.
That just doesn't seem possible.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
But I've found lots to do since then.
Well, we're going to talk about that too.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
with many guests, by now we'd kind of be finished the program, because we would have talked about their early life and their family and their career. But with you, that was just a beginning. And I want to explore with you, Joyce, some of the marvelous volunteer work that you've done for this community, because people may not be aware of the impact beyond CLH that you've had in the community. So let's begin with the Family Life Center. Tell us about that.
The Family Life Center, they were considering expanding north of Toronto. That was run by the Archdiocese of Toronto. It's the North Simcoe Catholic Family Life Center. And at that time, there were no facilities in the community where people could go for counseling. If you wanted marriage counseling, any kind of counseling, you would have to go to the mental health center. And a lot of people were not willing to do that. Of course, there's always stigmas attached to things, rightly or wrongly. And so we brought the Family Life Center to Midland, got funding from the diocese, and that was its first mandate, to provide counseling to people in need of counseling. And it just grew from there.
And you assumed a pretty major role there yourself.
Well, I did chair it for the first 5 years.
Yeah.
And yes, I did. I was happy to do that.
Another significant institution in this community is the Rosewood Shelter for Women. And you had a big part to play in that too, Joyce.
Well, the Catholic Family Life Center did a survey, and the most needed thing in the community was deemed by the community to be a shelter for women. So we formed a committee, and we started working on that to get Rosewood started. And I was happy to be part of that committee. I was not only interested, but also I had a lot of connection with the local ministry, which made it easier because we were talking to some of the same people that I was dealing with to get funding. So that was my role with.
And how long were you involved with Rosewood?
Probably for about 3 or 4 years. I sat on the board. I didn't chair or do anything like that, but I was involved.
Now, there was another initiative, the Family Playhouse.
Well, that was when we realized that we needed a place, an early childhood place for children. So I did not work extensively with them, but I did call a meeting of all the agencies and the ministry and said, we do not want to run this. We're not starting this program with community living heading it up. We think it's needed, but it should be a community thing, and it should not come under our umbrella. So that's how that got started.
And it's interesting that those institutions survived.
They did.
Yeah.
They were so necessary to the community.
You were also involved in the Victims Crisis Vickers program.
Oh, yes. Well, I guess a certain member of my family seemed to have had an influence in that. At least one of the police officers called me and asked me if I would go to a meeting with him. And it was to get Vickers started. And we worked faithfully at trying to get funding to establish a separate unit in Midland, and soon realized that wasn't going to happen. And then we asked, well, could it be run out of Barrie? Could they just supply staff and use the same CEO and everything was in place? So that would be a simpler way of getting started, and that's what happened.
Was there a specific incident that led you and a certain member of your family to think that that was important for the community?
I think Paul thought that it was important for victims to have support.
Right.
He's always been a very caring person.
Yeah.
And he knew that they did need support.
Yeah. Now, as if all of that isn't enough, Joyce, you also served on the board at Huronia District Hospital.
I did, for several years. That was during the Davis days when we were having a lot of difficulty with hospitals, and they were wanting to totally close Penetanguishene. And then during that period of time, we did a lot of talking with the ministry, a lot of local talks, and we jointly arranged that the two hospitals would amalgamate under the one board, and that would keep the two hospitals open and better serve the community that way. So it was during that period of time.
And how long would you have served the hospital?
I think about 5-6 years.
Okay.
Yes.
And then? Then you decided there was another...
The fundraising side. Yes, just for 2 or 3 years.
So that was on the hospital foundation?
Hospital foundation, yes.
Yeah. They didn't want to let you go, Joyce. You also, and I confess I didn't know this, but I understand that you were on the CCAC board.
I was.
Tell us about that. First of all, explain to our audience what that is.
Community Care Access Center. I had just retired, and Bob Morton came to me and said that, asked me if I'd like to serve on the board, and I said yes. So I was there from I think they'd been in business for 1 year. So I was there for the foundational part of community care access centers, and served on the board for about 5 years, I guess. Then I became chair of the board, and the following year, the government intervened and started making government appointees to that board.
I was going to tease you and ask you whether the fact that you were the chair caused the government to come in and take over.
Possibly.
You're currently involved with the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. Again, can you explain to our audience what work that wonderful organization does?
The Society of St. Vincent de Paul works with the poor. And it does have a branch that works with prisons. So I worked for many years just with community people, and eventually, of course, well, that's another story, led to my involvement at the prison.
Yeah. What kind of work did you do with the St. Paul de Vincent group?
Originally, I helped a lot of people apply for housing help.
Mm-hmm.
There were certain programs going on, but they'd need help, and I would do that. And just sometimes they needed help with food. They needed help with different things, so we were involved with that. The Society of St. Vincent de Paul does currently run the food pantry out of St. Margaret's, and the society eventually paid for the prison ministry for any expenses there. And we today are very involved. There's always 2 or 3 people that don't qualify for whatever's going in terms of help for, or they'd be on the street. So we do put them up in motels, and we pay not a huge number, but
right.
We're a stopgap until they can get other help.
Now, I understand that in providing Christmas gifts and food support for needy families, that this was a family affair for the Hamelin family.
For many years, that was a special role. The giving tree. The giving tree went up, and of course, then the gifts came in. So my task always was to operate that part of it. So eventually, my daughter-in-law Brenda became involved, and last year my great-granddaughter became involved, and other members of the family as well, including Alex, who is now doing a fantastic job of trying to get the food bank organized here for the whole community. And Alex, I think Alex was in grade 9 the first time she came to help me, but she always said that she enjoyed doing that. And we were so happy to have somebody young there, because sometimes there'd be a gift request and we'd have a whole pile of toys on the table, and us old fuddy-duddies would look, and I'd say, well, what in God's name is that? You know, I see what it's called, but I don't know what it looks like. And Alex was always there to say, oh, Grandma, it's this or it's that, or maybe we didn't have it. Yeah.
I know the feeling, Joyce.
Yeah. Okay.
You began to tell us about venturing into the Alpha work. And so I'd like to just back up a little bit and ask if you can explain to our audience what Alpha is.
Alpha is a program that introduces people to Christianity. And, well, I'd have to backtrack a bit. When the jail opened in 20 years ago in Penetanguishene, I knew the chaplain there. I'd met the chaplain, and I was volunteering with the Society of St. Vincent de Paul to go in and do short visits with people. And I remember my first visit there. we sat in a room, and the guard came in and said, "That's the red button. You press if there's any trouble." I can assure you, I sat so close to that button because I kept thinking, what are you doing here?
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was my first experience. And then that experience changed. There was no Alpha program right at the beginning. It was just visiting. But I got to know some of the inmates, and I can honestly say that the inmates have taught me more than anything else I've ever done.
Joyce, I'm familiar with Alpha. As you know, I've led Alpha
Yes.
myself, and I'm just wondering what kind of relationships you would have developed as a result of that. You're dealing with incarcerated people
Yes.
who don't have to do this program, who come and choose to do it. What kind of relationships would you develop?
That was so interesting. Well, we started with just one Alpha program, and that went very well. And then over the next period of time, well, my first task was to find volunteers to do the Alpha program. And I come from St. Margaret's Parish, but I knew that the rest of the world didn't always go to St. Margaret's. And so I had to make sure that I had a variety of congregations that were represented as volunteers. So I went looking. Some people came from Barrie, some people came from Aurelius, some from all around. And I tried to diversify the background of the volunteers as much as I could. So I ended up with 30-some volunteers.
Wow.
And we were able to run for many years, 3 to 4 programs. We did it in the spring and we did it in the fall. And the programs were probably 12 weeks duration. So we would start in March and end in June, and we would start in September and end just before Christmas.
And how many would be in a session?
We were allowed to have 32 people congregate at the same time, no more.
And how many lives do you think you touched?
I know that we've done Alpha for more than 2,000 people,
Wow.
way more, over many years. And I have to say that that was one of the most rewarding things I've ever done. But I certainly learned a lot about what I didn't know about people. Because we tend to be so judgmental. And if you just listen, we're all the same. My famous saying as I open the Alpha program, I'm so glad you're here. And I know what you're looking for, even if you don't. You're looking for love. Because we all want to be loved.
Right.
Nobody argues with that.
Yeah. Now, you and I chatted a week or so ago, and you were going to an event on November the 3rd that had to do with Alpha, or was it the jail?
That got canceled, Fred.
Oh, did it?
It got canceled.
Well, we're not going to talk about that for long, then, are we?
I think COVID interfered. Last-minute cancellation. Yeah.
Now, let's move to another of your interests and involvements, and that's the Martyrs Shrine.
That's one of my most favorite places. I love the Martyrs Shrine. I guess I kind of like the Jesuit philosophy. And yes, I started volunteering at the shrine. Few jobs. If we ever get back, I was always a lector for many years at the shrine, and I would get other lectors. I would organize that, and whoever was in charge would look after the training. So that was one of the things we did. But also, I was instrumental in convincing one of the directors that he needed to have a fundraising event that involved the community. Because where there is a shrine, there is a financial benefit to that community. And the local merchants recognized that too, so they were very generous in offering support in terms of the gifts they could provide for auctions, etc., and sponsoring. So that, I think the first one was a Hamelin event. Paul was the auctioneer, the whole Grace was the spokesperson, and my family bought everything in sight. They did all their Christmas shopping. I remember Laura buying these chairs, and oh my goodness. So it was a small event in terms of our goal was 25,000, and I think we just barely made our goal, but it was the beginning, and that just grew, and it's taken on different formats, like everything else. Even in the last couple of years, they've changed to virtual, and amazing how successful that is.
Oh, that's great. Now, you were on the board at the Shrine for many years.
Yes.
Do you remember how many?
I think for about 9 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, you've been recognized with a number of awards, Joyce, and I don't want to embarrass you, but I think that our friends in the audience would be interested in some of the recognitions that you've received. Can you remember any of them? Or?
Well, I guess the John Gibson Award, and Fred, I believe you presented that to me.
I remember that.
Many years ago.
Yeah.
So the John Gibson Award was for community service.
Yes.
And then the provincial government recognized my service, and I was presented with a plaque and a beautiful, beautiful clock that was made by the inmates. That I really love.
Yeah.
So there was that, and then there was, dear me.
You received the Award of Merit from Midland. From the
I
town.
did, from the town of Midland.
Yeah.
But that's not really the most important thing. I mean, I think the most important thing for me is I've had a wonderful life, and I guess I love people. I love to be involved, and I couldn't help it. If I saw a need, I'd think, oh, somebody better do something about that. And sometimes the somebody was me.
Everybody else stepped back, and you were the one still standing.
Fix that.
Joyce, it's a marvelous, marvelous career of service that you have provided. And I'd just like to reflect on it for a moment. What do you feel your strengths were that brought you to, I mean, you initiated a lot of these organizations. You sort of say it's a group, but in many cases you were the driving force. What was it in you that caused you to be able to step forward and make things happen?
Well, I happen to be a Christian. I happen to be a Catholic. But I always thought, I mean, there's only one commandment. And every time I went to confession, well, I might as well confess publicly, I'd say to myself, well, you broke the first commandment. That's number one. Because the first commandment is to love God with your whole heart and your neighbor as yourself. So if I didn't love my neighbor, I couldn't possibly love God.
Mm-hmm. Good for you.
So that probably is still my confession, and it probably still is my way of saying you can't even be a Christian if you don't love others. It just doesn't work.
Good. One of your pleasurable parts of your life has been your travel.
Oh, I love to travel.
And I wonder if you could tell us about some of the special travel experiences that you've had.
Well, believe it or not, Fred, I've been to the Holy Land 3 times. And each time has been special for whatever reason. And I just think that I remember one time, the last time I was there, I was on the plane with this couple beside me, and I so admired him. It was a night flight, of course, and his partner or wife, I didn't know which, but her head kept slipping off the arm of the seat, and he'd get a pillow and he'd tuck it under her, and he'd tuck the blanket around her, and I'm thinking, oh, boy, you're a keeper. Look, you're looking after her and she's sound asleep. You're not even getting brownie points. I thought, oh. So finally it was time for me to get my bag down and from the, wherever you put them on top of the plane, the overhead. Yeah. And of course he jumped up and got it down for me. And he said, your first time to Israel? And I said, no, my 3rd. Well, he couldn't believe that. You're coming back a 3rd time. I have to give you a gift. We talked quite a bit. And I said, no, it's fine. Finally, before I left, he went into his pocket and he gave me a pin. It was the Star of David. And he told me it was the pin he had worn on his uniform all through his military career.
Wow.
And I said, oh, I can't accept that. And he said, you must. So beautiful. We meet wonderful people everywhere we go.
Yeah. Now, I've heard about a story about you in Amsterdam.
Oh. Well, you know, Amsterdam has a famous area. It's called the Red Light District. And believe it or not, I was with a nun.
That's your story, right?
That's my story. Yeah. And she said to me, I'd love to go and see what that's like. Will you come with me? And I said, well, I do. I want to go too. And so we got a couple of other women and we said, that's where we're going to go. We're just going to go see. And finally somebody came along and said, look, don't be idiots. You can't go somewhere and just stop and stare. You're going to get in trouble. Anyway, we did go. We didn't get very far down the street. We'd seen enough. The window displays were very descriptive. And we decided that was good enough. We'd seen it. Yeah. So we came back.
Good for you. What other vacations have you had that particularly resonate with you?
Well, I think, one of the I loved being in Paris with 2 of my granddaughters.
Wonderful.
One of my granddaughters, Nicole, was teaching in England. So she invited the girls to come over, and one was 14. She celebrated her 14th birthday while we were there, and the other one was 16. So Nicole, we did some touring around England on the weekend, and then Nicole was teaching, so the 2 girls and I boarded a plane, and we went over to Paris. And we stayed in this very small hotel. Well, the girls were just thrilled. We'd get on the on and off bus and do a tour every day, and we always ended up in a part of the city where they were more interested for whatever reason, and then we'd take a taxi home. But we had a wonderful time. It was, one of them was having her 14th birthday. And I thought, I'd like to take her to the Moulin Rouge. But I didn't know. I thought, nah, I had been, and I knew that there was nothing there that was going to be terrible, except that the dancers didn't wear tops, but they were so decorated that you'd never notice. They had all these exquisite things. Anyway, so I said, I'm not taking you for dinner because I know you won't eat what's there. So we had some dinner, and we went. And the girls were really excited, and they said, you're right, Grandma. You just don't notice anything. It's the dancing you notice. And it's all mime, so there was really nothing that went on that should scandalize them. They thoroughly enjoyed it. Yeah. And then when we got back, the first thing they did was call their parents and tell them where they'd been. And I wasn't in their bad books.
I thought we got to swear our grandchildren to secrecy in those things. That didn't work?
Well, I'm sure they couldn't. No way.
Now, we mentioned briefly your family and 10 kids. How many grandchildren do you have?
19.
19 grandchildren.
And they've graced me with 18 great-grandchildren.
18 great-grandchildren. Wow.
Yes.
Could I ask the children to stand? Glenn, could we put some house lights on for a minute?
Do we have?
Well, don't be shy.
Okay.
Thank you and welcome. That is the first time I've ever seen any of your children be shy. What's that all about?
I agree with you. I don't know.
Yeah. And do we have any grandchildren or great-grandchildren here? Would they stand up? Yeah.
Ah.
Thank you. Tell us what your family means to you, Joyce.
Well, I think my family means everything to me. I have a wonderful family. Nobody wears a halo, but neither does their mother, and neither did their father. So, but they are all very generous people. They all are very community-oriented. Yep. They all serve in the community in some way or other. And maybe that was just a way of life.
Well, they had to learn it somewhere.
Yeah, I think they learned at home
yes.
that to serve.
Yeah.
And their dad was involved with the Legion, and he, did some wonderful things too.
Yeah.
So I think.
Well, I think it's fair to say, and I say this for the benefit of the non-Hamelin people in the audience, all three of you, but I think it's fair to say that the Midland Penetanguishene area is a much better place to live because of the Hamelin family.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Joyce, you mentioned your faith, and I think that's something that you and I share in common, and I don't think either of us are afraid to talk about it. No. Can you tell our audience how your faith has sustained you through the years?
Well, first of all, let me tell you something that happened that really inspired me and led me to believe that I was doing the right thing when I went to the prison. I went to something called Oberammergau, which is the Passion Play. And I went in the year that the jail, just before the jail opened, it was 20 years ago. It was all, they celebrate this Passion Play. It's the whole village that's involved. It's an outdoor theater, and it lasts 6 hours. 3 hours in the morning, you go and have lunch, come back in the afternoon. It's in the Bavarian Hills, an outdoor theater, and the music is just fantastic. And it just tells the Christ story. And as a backdrop, there are all the scenes from the Old Testament that support this. But anyway, I was sitting there, and all of a sudden, it's time for Judas. And these are the words I heard. See Judas fall into the darkness below. Why does no brother hold him tight? And I started to cry. I'd never thought about that. And I couldn't stop. And when I left there, I kept thinking, I wonder who the Judases are today. That wouldn't be their name, but who would they be? Why did that affect me so much? Why did I burst into tears and couldn't get over it? And eventually, as I got involved in the prison, I thought, perhaps this is society's vision of a Judas, somebody who's a betrayer today. Mm-hmm. So that reassured me in that sense, that I always thought I was supposed to be there.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful story.
I don't know if that makes sense to you. But
absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I do. We're just about out of time, but we have a number of people here from CLH Development Services. I'm wondering if you have a word of wisdom for them or a word of encouragement.
To work for CLH or to be part of CLH is a great privilege because everyone has something to give. And that's where you learn how to give, by being with people who give, who teach you how to give. And I think that's probably life's greatest gift.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Well, let me tell those of you who are in the hall here that momentarily we're going to wrap up our broadcast portion, but we do want you to stay. We're going to ask Joyce some of the questions that you have provided to us and put Joyce a little bit on the hot seat here with some questions. But before we do that, I want to extend some thanks. I want to thank the folks from Rogers TV who've been very supportive of this program for the last 20 months. We've had to do the program on Zoom. It has opened up to us some wonderful guests who we would never have had the opportunity to bring to Midland, and they've been very supportive. So thanks to Kevin Kelly and his staff, including Madison, who is our camera person this evening. I also want to thank the MCC staff. You'll be probably aware that the Midland Cultural Centre has only been open now for a very short period of time. This is one of the first audiences that we've had in this hall, and so I want to thank our Executive Director Dan Broom and his staff for all the work that they've done, and thanks to Glenn who's up in the booth. I want to thank our season sponsors, Kathy Bales, Michelle Dishaw, and Jeff Holloway. I want to thank CLH Development Support Services for their support of this program. Joyce, I'll thank you after the question and answer period, but for the benefit of the TV audience, on their behalf, I will thank you for being our guest and for being such a fascinating contributor to this program. So, to those of you who are watching on television, we thank you for being with us. We wish you well, and we'll see you next time.